So, officers, shocked to know that the same black woman you bullied all night in Spanish is the Spanish ambassador to your country?
Probablemente and I siquiera tiene documentos. Probably doesn't even have papers, Officer Reed said in Spanish, laughing as he stood over the homeless woman on the concrete steps, completely unaware that she understood every single word. His partner joined in, mocking her appearance in broken Spanish, their body cameras recording everything they thought would stay secret. Then she reached into her worn jacket, pulled out a leather credential holder with a gold seal, and when she flipped it open under the streetlight, both officers realized they just made the worst mistake of their entire lives, because the homeless woman they bullied mercilessly and were about to arrest was someone who could end them with 3 words. The November night rain pressed cold against the city, its icy fingers finding every gap in worn fabric and threadbare layers. Tiffany Moreno sat motionless on the concrete steps of the shuttered Riverside Community Center, her shopping cart standing guard beside her like a silent sentinel. Inside it, plastic bags stuffed with blankets, a few cans of food, cardboard for insulation, everything she'd been carrying for 3 brutal days. To the handful of people still on the streets at this hour, she was invisible. Just another shadow in a city full of forgotten faces. But invisibility, she had learned over 72 hours, could be the most dangerous kind of exposure. She pulled her worn jacket tighter, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, and watched the empty street with eyes that held secrets no one could imagine. This November night would teach 2 police officers a lesson they would never forget, one that would cost them their careers and change an entire city's approach to its most vulnerable. If you believe in the power of dignity, the necessity of respect, and the truth that every human being deserves to be treated with humanity regardless of their circumstances, then stay with this story. Because what happens next will restore your faith that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly denied. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, like the story, click subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now back to the story. Tiffany had been living on these streets for 3 days, but not by circumstance, by choice. Not the kind of choice that comes from privilege or adventure, but the kind that comes from duty. The kind that demands you walk into darkness to expose it to light. She worked double shifts now, not serving food but surviving without it. Her workplace wasn't an office with colleagues, but street corners with strangers who'd learned that society had written them off as problems instead of people. She rarely complained, not even when hunger made her lightheaded, when cold made her bones ache, or when exhaustion blurred the edges of her vision. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she'd always possessed, the kind that can't be stripped away by circumstance, only revealed more clearly by it. That night, the Riverside district felt emptier than usual. Most of the other homeless individuals had found their spots for the night, doorways, alcoves, anywhere that blocked the wind. The community center behind her had been shuttered for months, promised renovations never materializing, another broken commitment to people the city preferred not to see. Tiffany had chosen these steps deliberately. They were visible from the main street, well lit, and according to her briefing, regularly patrolled by 2 specific officers. Officers with a reputation. Officers who used a particular method to humiliate people they deemed beneath them. Headlights cut through the darkness like judgment itself, slow and deliberate. A patrol car rolled to a stop, its engine idling with a low, predatory rumble. 2 men emerged with the kind of swagger that comes not from confidence but from unchecked authority. Officers Reed and George Bloomfield. Reed, the 15-year veteran with a face hardened by cynicism and a record quietly buried in personnel files. Bloomfield, younger and eager, following his partner's lead like an apprentice learning cruelty as a craft. Power, Tiffany had learned, doesn't always corrupt. Sometimes it just reveals what was already there. These men wore badges that were supposed to protect and serve. Instead, they wore them like permission slips for casual brutality. Tiffany kept her eyes downcast, maintaining the role she'd perfected over 3 days. Her hands, usually manicured and elegant, were now dirty and weathered. Her posture, usually commanding boardrooms and diplomatic functions, was now hunched and defensive. She was invisible. Forgettable. Beneath notice. Reed approached first, his boots heavy on the pavement. He stopped a few feet away, hands resting on his belt in a stance designed to intimidate. Then he spoke, his voice dripping with mockery, switching to a language he assumed would be his secret weapon. ¿Qué pasa, señora? He called out in Spanish, his tone making it clear this wasn't a question but a taunt. Bloomfield snickered, positioning himself to Reed's right. Reed continued in rapid Spanish, his words designed to wound. Comments about how pathetic she looked, how these people always smelled, how they should just clean up the streets and send them all away where decent citizens wouldn't have to look at them. His Spanish was fluent, a gift from an ex-wife he'd once loved and now used as a weapon against people who reminded him of her heritage. Bloomfield joined in with broken Spanish, his accent terrible but his cruelty fluent, observations about her hair, her clothes, her shopping cart, jokes about whether she even understood them. They laughed together, their voices carrying through the empty street, each word a deliberate assault designed to dehumanize and demean. Tiffany remained perfectly still, her face calm, though her heart pounded with a mixture of rage and profound sadness. She understood every syllable, every insult, every casual cruelty. After all, she wasn't just a homeless woman enduring harassment. She was Ambassador Tiffany Moreno, Spanish ambassador to the United States, fluent in 6 languages including perfect Castilian Spanish. A woman who had spent 3 days undercover, documenting exactly this kind of abuse for a State Department investigation that would influence billions in federal policy. She had heard these words before, not directed at her, but at others. In reports filed and ignored. In testimonies given and dismissed. In the quiet confessions of people who'd been made to feel invisible, worthless, less than human. Now she understood their pain with crushing, personal clarity. She wanted to stand up immediately. To end this charade and watch these men crumble. She had the power, diplomatic credentials in her inner pocket, a wire recording every word, body cameras capturing every moment. But something made her wait. Something made her let them continue. Because the world needed to see exactly who they were when they thought no one important was watching. The world needed to see how power without accountability becomes tyranny in a uniform. Reed stepped closer, his hand now resting near his handcuffs. ¿Habla español? He asked mockingly, then turned to his partner with a smirk. Mira esta mujer. Probablemente en ni siquiera tiene documentos. Deberíamos arrestarla por. The moment crystallized. 3 days of documentation. 3 days of experiencing what thousands endured daily. 3 days of silent observation. It ended now. Tiffany lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting Reed's directly for the first time. Her voice cut through the cold night air, quiet but absolutely clear, her Spanish accent pure Castilian, the Spanish of diplomats and royalty, unmistakable in its education and authority. Yo soy embajadora. 3 words. I am an ambassador. The street seemed to stop breathing. Reed and Bloomfield froze mid-laugh, confusion flickering across their faces before being replaced by something far more dangerous, dawning comprehension. Tiffany rose from the concrete steps with deliberate grace, her movements shedding the hunched posture of survival and revealing the commanding presence of authority. Despite her worn jacket and dirty hands, dignity radiated from her like light from a flame that refused to be extinguished. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket, slowly, carefully, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Reed's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before stopping, some primal part of his brain recognizing that this moment had shifted beyond his control. From her pocket, she pulled a leather credential holder, somehow still pristine despite 3 days on the streets, protected like the truth it represented. She opened it under the streetlight, and the official seal caught the light, gold and unmistakable. Her photograph. Professional, polished, powerful. Her name, Ambassador Tiffany Moreno. Her title, Spanish Ambassador to the United States of America. Kingdom of Spain. Full diplomatic status. The blood drained from Reed's face as if someone had opened a valve. Bloomfield took an involuntary step backward, his hand trembling, his earlier swagger evaporating like breath in cold air. The badges that had made them feel powerful now felt like anchors dragging them toward a depth they couldn't escape. Tiffany spoke again, switching to flawless English, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to reveal. "I understand every word you said," she began, her tone measured, almost gentle, which made it more devastating. "Every insult. Every taunt. Every dehumanizing comment. Every assumption you made about my worth based on how I looked." She paused, letting each word settle like stones. "For 3 days, I've walked in shoes you've never had to wear. I've felt the stares, the dismissals, the casual cruelty. And tonight, you've given me the clearest evidence of what thousands have reported, that some officers abuse their power to terrorize the most vulnerable." Reed tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, words failing him completely. Bloomfield looked physically ill, his face pale, his career flashing before his eyes in terrible clarity. "I'm not finished," Tiffany continued, raising her hand slightly. "I've been documenting everything for a State Department investigation into how homeless populations are treated by law enforcement in this city. Your body cameras are recording this conversation. My wire," she touched her collar, revealing the small device, "has been recording everything for 3 days. Tomorrow morning, your precinct captain will receive a full report, along with a formal diplomatic complaint filed with the State Department and the Department of Justice." The reality crashed over them like a wave. Bloomfield's knees seemed to buckle slightly. Reed, his earlier arrogance shattered, appeared to age 10 years in 10 seconds. "I could have you arrested right now," Tiffany said, her voice never rising, never emotional, which made it more powerful. "Diplomatic harassment, abuse of authority, civil rights violations, intimidation. But that would be too easy. Too quick. Too merciful." She let that hang in the air. "Instead, you're going to learn. You're going to attend every diversity and homelessness awareness training your department offers. You're going to volunteer at shelters and soup kitchens. You're going to hear the stories of people like Maria, James, and Sarah, people whose names you never bothered to learn, whose humanity you never bothered to recognize. And you're going to think about this moment every single time you put on that uniform. Every single time." The street remained silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the harsh breathing of two men whose worlds had just collapsed. Within 48 hours, the body camera footage would go viral. National outrage would force immediate action. Reed would resign in disgrace, unable to face the mirror or his family. Bloomfield would be demoted, but in that demotion would find something Reed never would, a chance at redemption through genuine transformation. But that night, standing on the cold steps of the Riverside Community Center, Tiffany Moreno wasn't thinking about viral videos or policy changes. She was thinking about Maria, the elderly woman she'd met on day one, who'd cried when Tiffany shared her last piece of bread. About James, the veteran with PTSD who protected the others, but couldn't protect himself from a system that had forgotten him. About Sarah, the domestic violence survivor whose children had been taken because homelessness was deemed proof of inadequate parenting. She was thinking about the 3 days that changed her understanding of dignity, suffering, and the razor-thin line between visibility and invisibility in America. Just 72 hours earlier, everything had been different. The concrete steps where she now stood would have been beneath her notice, something to step over, perhaps, but never to sit upon. 72 hours ago, she had been wearing Valentino instead of worn denim, discussing international trade agreements instead of where to find a warm meal, sleeping in Egyptian cotton instead of shivering under threadbare blankets. 72 hours ago, she had been Madam Ambassador, living a life of diplomatic privilege that felt as distant now as a dream from another lifetime. But that was before the phone call. Before the mission. Before she understood what it truly meant to be invisible in plain sight. The memory of that Tuesday morning felt like it belonged to another lifetime. though only 72 hours separated the woman on the cold street from the woman who had awakened in Egyptian cotton sheets in a Georgetown townhouse filled with morning light. Tuesday had started the way most of Tiffany Moreno's mornings began, with precision, elegance, and purpose. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her bedroom, casting golden rectangles across hardwood floors that gleamed with the kind of polish that came from professional care. She'd risen at 6, as always, her internal clock calibrated by 2 decades of diplomatic service that had taught her that power belonged to those who claimed the morning before others even opened their eyes. Her home reflected the life she'd built through merit and relentless dedication, tasteful art from her travels, shelves lined with books in 6 languages, furniture that balanced comfort with a kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted wealth. The kitchen, all white marble and stainless steel, smelled of fresh coffee, Colombian, medium roast, ground minutes before brewing. She poured it into fine bone china, a gift from the Spanish Prime Minister after her successful negotiation of a trade agreement that had taken 3 years and the patience of a saint. She carried her coffee to the reading nook overlooking her private garden, where her briefing documents waited in a neat stack. Today's schedule: morning meeting with the Deputy Secretary of State, lunch with the French ambassador to discuss climate policy coordination, afternoon session with a human rights delegation from Barcelona. A normal day. A day that felt important in the way that days filled with meetings and documents and policy discussions always felt important. Tiffany was 45 years old, though people often guessed younger, a benefit of good genes, Spanish olive oil in her skincare routine, and the kind of purpose-driven life that kept the soul young even when the calendar pages turned. She'd been born in Barcelona to a family of modest means, her father a professor of linguistics, her mother a social worker who taught her that privilege was a responsibility, not a reward. Oxford had given her polish, Georgetown had given her access, but Barcelona had given her something neither prestigious university could provide: an understanding that dignity wasn't negotiable, regardless of one's address or bank account. 20 years as a career diplomat had taken her from junior postings in Brussels to senior positions in Geneva, from trade negotiations in Beijing to human rights advocacy in New York. She'd learned to navigate the delicate dance of international relations, where a single word could start a war or broker a peace, where power was performed in silk scarves and careful smiles. She spoke 6 languages fluently: Spanish, English, French, Catalan, German, and Mandarin, each one opening doors that remained closed to those who believed the world spoke only their tongue. But it was her work in human rights that had earned her international respect and, occasionally, international irritation. Tiffany Moreno didn't believe in diplomatic niceties when human suffering was involved. She'd walked into refugee camps when other ambassadors sent assistance. She'd visited prisons when others reviewed reports. She believed that understanding required proximity, that policy made in comfortable offices too often missed the truth that lived in uncomfortable places. It was this reputation that had led to her secret secondary role, the one that didn't appear on any official document: Special Consultant on Urban Vulnerability for the State Department's Homelessness Task Force. A role that had, until this moment, involved reviewing reports, attending confidential briefings, and providing recommendations from the comfortable distance of expertise. Her phone rang at 7:47 a.m., just as she was reviewing the climate policy briefing. The screen displayed a name that made her set down her coffee with careful attention: Director Patricia Hawthorne. "Patricia," Tiffany answered, switching to speaker as she stood and moved to the window. "You're calling early." "Because I have something that can't wait." Patricia's voice carried the particular tension of someone about to ask for something unreasonable and necessary. "How quickly can you get to my office?" "I have a meeting with the Deputy Secretary at 9. "Cancel it. This is bigger." 30 minutes later, Tiffany sat in Patricia Hawthorne's office in a nondescript government building where the real work of policy happened away from cameras and press conferences. Patricia was a woman in her 60s who'd spent 40 years in public service and had the kind of moral authority that came from choosing the harder right over the easier wrong repeatedly, for decades. "Your assistant Marcus called in sick this morning," Patricia began without preamble. Tiffany nodded. "Yes, the flu. He'll be out for a week." Which means you have no public schedule for the next 7 days. No one expecting to see you at functions. No meetings that can't be quietly rescheduled. Patricia leaned forward. Tiffany, we have a 3-day window for the operation we've been discussing. The operation. They'd been planning it for months. An undercover immersion into the homeless population of D.C. to document firsthand the systematic discrimination that reports and statistics could only hint at. Federal funding worth $2 billion hung in the balance, contingent on evidence strong enough to overcome political resistance and bureaucratic inertia. The Riverside District, Tiffany said, understanding crystallizing. We've had 7 formal complaints in the past month alone. Officers Reed and Bloomfield. They use Spanish to mock and humiliate homeless individuals, assuming their targets can't understand. It's deliberate, it's systematic, and it's exactly the kind of evidence we need to drive real reform. Patricia slid a folder across her desk. But we need someone who can document it from the inside. Someone who speaks perfect Spanish. Someone with diplomatic immunity if things go wrong. Someone with the credibility to testify before Congress. Tiffany opened the folder. Photos of officers, incident reports, maps of the Riverside District, profiles of the homeless population. Each page a story of dignity stripped away, humanity dismissed, power abused. 3 days, Patricia continued. You'd go in tonight. We'd have eyes on you from a distance, emergency extraction protocols, legal protections. But you'd be living on the streets, experiencing everything they experience, documenting everything. Yes, Tiffany said without hesitation. Patricia blinked. You haven't even. Yes, Tiffany repeated. She closed the folder and met Patricia's eyes. When do we begin? The decision wasn't impulsive, though it appeared that way. It was rooted in memory, in her grandmother's stories of post-war Spain, when economic devastation had put even middle-class families one crisis away from the streets. Her grandmother had spent 3 months homeless after Tiffany's grandfather died suddenly, leaving debts no one knew existed. She'd spoken of it only once, near the end of her life, describing the particular cruelty of invisibility, of watching people look through her as though she'd ceased to exist as a human being worthy of acknowledgement. Privilege isn't just what you have, her grandmother had said, holding Tiffany's hand with fingers bent by arthritis and age. It's what you do with it. You have education, position, respect. Use them for those who have none of those things. Promise me. Tiffany had promised. And she'd spent 20 years keeping that promise in conference rooms and policy papers. But her grandmother hadn't suffered invisibility in conference rooms. She'd suffered it in doorways and on street corners, where policy became personal and theory became pain. The next 6 hours moved with the orchestrated precision of a military operation. A task force meeting at 10 a.m. where legal protections were reviewed, diplomatic immunity would shield her from arrest, but she couldn't invoke it unless absolutely necessary without compromising the operation. Wire equipment was fitted, a sophisticated device disguised as a button on her jacket, capable of recording 72 hours of audio with backup to encrypted cloud storage. Emergency contacts were established. A tracker sewn into the lining of her jacket. Code words for extraction if the situation became dangerous. Patricia made it clear. You can end this at any moment. Your safety is more important than any evidence. But Tiffany had no intention of ending it early. 3 days. She would see it through. The transformation began at 2 p.m. in a facility that specialized in undercover operations. The costume department had assembled clothing from actual homeless services, donated items too worn for most people to want but perfect for someone surviving on streets. Jeans with frayed hems and permanent stains. A jacket that had once been blue but had faded to indeterminate gray. Shirts layered for warmth rather than style. Shoes that would protect feet but announce with every step that their wearer couldn't afford better. A makeup artist added weathering to her face and hands. Dirt worked into the creases of her palms, her nail beds, the lines around her eyes. Artificial aging that made her look 10 years older and infinitely more exhausted. They tied her usually elegant hair back in a simple ponytail, making it look unwashed, uncared for. Contact lenses slightly clouded her normally bright eyes. A shopping cart was assembled with the careful attention of a stage production. Plastic bags, tattered blankets, a few cans of food, cardboard pieces for insulation, a battered thermos. Everything authentic, everything telling a story of survival at its most basic level. Her diplomatic credentials, the leather holder with her official identification and the seal of the Kingdom of Spain, were placed in a waterproof pouch sewn into the inner pocket of her jacket. Her only lifeline. Her only proof that this was temporary, that she could end the invisibility whenever she chose. At 4 p.m., she stood before a full-length mirror and didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back wasn't Ambassador Tiffany Moreno. She was no one. Anonymous. Forgettable. Invisible. Remarkable, Patricia said quietly, standing beside her. Are you sure about this? Tiffany touched the hidden pocket where her credentials rested. I'm sure. Evening was falling when a nondescript black SUV dropped her at the edge of the Riverside district. The driver, a State Department security agent named Marcus Chin, gave her final instructions through his earpiece. We'll have eyes on you from a distance. You're being tracked. Code word for extraction is Barcelona. Say it to anyone, and we'll have you out in under 5 minutes. Understood, Tiffany said, her hand on the door handle. Ambassador, Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine concern. Most people in your position wouldn't do this. They'd review the reports and sign the policy papers from a comfortable office. Tiffany met his eyes in the rearview mirror. Most people in my position have forgotten what it means to have no position at all. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The shopping cart was unloaded and placed beside her. The SUV's door closed with a heavy thunk that felt like a portal ceiling behind her. As the vehicle drove away, its taillights disappearing into evening traffic, Tiffany Moreno stood alone on a street corner in a neighborhood she'd driven through 100 times but never truly seen. The November air bit through her thin jacket. The shopping cart's wheel squeaked when she pushed it. People passing on the opposite sidewalk glanced at her and immediately looked away, their gazes sliding off her as though she were part of the urban landscape rather than a person within it. She was invisible. For the first time in her adult life, no one knew who she was. No one cared. No one saw an ambassador or a diplomat or a woman with 6 languages and 20 years of service. They saw a problem. A statistic. Someone to be avoided. As she pushed the cart toward the community center where she'd been instructed to establish her presence, Tiffany understood that she was about to see America from an angle she'd only read about in reports. She had no idea how devastating and revealing that angle would be. She had no idea that 3 days from now, she'd be standing on concrete steps teaching 2 police officers the hardest lesson of their lives. But she was about to find out. The first hour taught Tiffany more about invisibility than 20 years of policy papers ever could. She pushed her shopping cart down the sidewalk, its squeaking wheel announcing her presence to people who had perfected the art of not noticing. A woman in yoga pants and expensive running shoes approached from the opposite direction, saw Tiffany, and crossed to the other side of the street mid-block without breaking stride. A businessman in a tailored suit stepped around her cart with the same careful avoidance he might give a pile of garbage. His eyes never once met hers. It wasn't hostility exactly. Hostility required acknowledgement. This was something far more dehumanizing, a collective agreement that she simply didn't exist as a person worth seeing. Tiffany found a spot near a closed storefront, out of the main pedestrian flow, and leaned against the wall. The November evening pressed cold through her thin jacket, and she understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't like the cold she'd experienced on ski trips or winter walks in Georgetown. This was cold without escape, cold without end, cold that would follow her into whatever approximation of sleep she could find tonight. You can't stay here. The voice came from a man emerging from the store, not yet closed, she realized, just dim inside. The owner, middle-aged with tired eyes that suggested he'd had this conversation before. "I'm not bothering anyone," Tiffany said quietly, staying in character. "You're bothering me. Bad for business. Move along." Not cruel, but final. The door closed before she could respond. She moved along. 2 blocks down she saw them, other people with shopping carts, with backpacks holding everything they owned, with the particular posture of those who'd learned to make themselves small in public spaces. Near a bus stop bench, an elderly black woman sat sorting through a plastic bag, her movements careful and methodical. Beside her, a man who looked to be in his 50s stared at nothing, his eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare Tiffany had seen in war zones. "First night?" the woman asked as Tiffany approached, her voice carrying the warmth that suffering sometimes creates in those who refuse to let it make them cruel. Tiffany nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. "I'm Maria," the woman said. "This is James. We don't bite, and we share if we have anything worth sharing." She gestured to a spot on the bench. "Sit before your legs give out. They always do, the first night." Tiffany sat, and felt something in her chest crack slightly, the simple gift of being offered a seat, of being acknowledged as human. "Thank you." James turned his head slightly, assessing her with eyes that had seen too much. "Veteran?" he asked. "No. Medical bills? Eviction? Divorce?" "It's complicated," Tiffany said, the lie feeling necessary and shameful. "It always is," Maria said gently. "Nobody plans to be here. We all just woke up one day and found the bottom had fallen out." As darkness settled over the city, Tiffany learned their stories. Maria had been a home health aide until a stroke required surgery she couldn't afford. Medical bankruptcy led to eviction. Now she couldn't get a new ID because she didn't have an address, and couldn't get an address without an ID, a bureaucratic loop that trapped thousands. She'd been on the streets for 8 months. James was a veteran Marine Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan that had left him with PTSD and a Purple Heart he'd pawned for food money. The VA benefits he was entitled to remain trapped in a maze of paperwork and missed appointments that expected him to maintain a schedule when every night was a battle for survival. 3 years on the streets, and counting. That first night, Tiffany didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every sound felt threatening. Footsteps approaching, voices raised in anger blocks away, sirens cutting through the darkness, the rustle of rats in nearby garbage. The cold seeped into her bones despite the cardboard Maria had shown her how to arrange beneath her for insulation. The concrete was unforgiving, and every position hurt after 10 minutes. The wire device in her jacket recorded it all. Maria's quiet prayers, James's nightmares that jolted him awake with gasps that sounded like drowning, the sound of her own breathing irregular with cold and fear, and the beginning of understanding. Day 2 began with sunrise finding Tiffany exhausted in a way sleep had never addressed. Her body ached. Her stomach had moved beyond hunger into a hollow feeling that made her lightheaded. But Maria was already up, organizing her belongings, preparing for the day with the same routine Tiffany imagined she'd once applied to going to work. "Soup kitchen opens at 7, Maria announced. "St. Augustine's. It's a walk, but the food's decent and Father Miguel treats us like people." The soup kitchen was crowded, the line stretching down the block. Tiffany stood behind James and Maria, watching mothers with children, elderly men with weathered faces, young people who looked barely out of their teens. The diversity of poverty, she thought, documenting everything in her mental notes while her wire captured conversations. Inside, Father Miguel presided with gentle authority, ensuring everyone got a meal, a kind word, and most importantly, dignity. He called people by name, asked about their well-being, treated the serving line like a congregation rather than a charity case. Over watery oatmeal and bitter coffee, Tiffany met Sarah, a woman in her early 30s with a haunted look and a story that made Tiffany's heart clench. Domestic violence survivor, fled with her children, but the shelters were full. 2 months on a waiting list. Meanwhile, sleeping in her car when she could find parking, terrified her ex-husband would find them, more terrified that Child Protective Services would take her children for the crime of being homeless. "The system's supposed to help," Sarah said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "But every door needs an ID, an address, proof of this, documentation of that. How do you prove stability when you have none? How do you break the cycle when the cycle is designed to keep you spinning?" Tiffany documented everything. The patterns were emerging, systematic barriers that turned temporary crises into permanent conditions, bureaucracies that demanded stability from people in chaos, services overwhelmed and underfunded, and threaded through it all, the casual cruelty of a society that had decided homelessness was a moral failure rather than a policy failure. The indignities accumulated like paper cuts. A drugstore security guard followed her through every aisle when she tried to buy soap with the few dollars she'd been given for the operation. A restaurant refused her access to the bathroom, customers only, even when she offered to buy something. Mothers pulled children away from her on the sidewalk. A teenager filmed her on his phone, laughing, probably for social media content that would treat her suffering as entertainment. By afternoon, the physical toll was undeniable. Exhaustion made her thoughts fuzzy. Hunger was a constant companion. The cold had settled into her bones in a way that made her wonder if she'd ever feel truly warm again. Simple things she'd taken for granted, a hot shower, a clean bathroom, a place to sit without being told to move, felt like luxuries from a different universe. Late afternoon brought her first police encounter. Officers Johnson and Martinez, a routine patrol finding her and James sitting on a bench in Riverside Park as dusk approached. "Park closes at sunset," Officer Johnson said, his tone professionally neutral. "You need to move along." "Where should we go?" James asked, genuine question in his voice. "That's not my problem," Martinez replied. "Not cruel, just factual. Just not here." They moved along. Always moving along, Tiffany thought. Never moving toward anything, just away from places where their presence made others uncomfortable. The badge created distance, turned people into problems to be managed rather than citizens to be protected. She noted it all. Day 3 arrived with Tiffany feeling hollowed out, her comfortable life now feeling like a memory from someone else's biography. Her body hurt in places she didn't know could hurt. Her dignity felt frayed. But her resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. Morning brought a text on the burner phone hidden in her cart, Patricia checking in, offering extraction. Tiffany replied with one word, "Tonight." Tonight was why she was here. Intelligence had confirmed Officers Reed and Bloomfield would be working the evening shift in Riverside District. Their pattern of harassment using Spanish had been documented by others, but without the kind of evidence that could force systemic change. Tonight, she would provide that evidence. She spent the day positioning herself, saying goodbye to Maria, James, and Sarah with promises she intended to keep. "I won't forget you," she told them. "Any of you." "Everyone forgets us," Sarah said sadly. "That's what we are. Forgettable." "Not to me," Tiffany replied. "Never to me." As sunset painted the sky orange and purple, Tiffany settled onto the cold concrete steps of the Riverside Community Center. Her body ached. Her spirit felt bruised. But her resolve had never been stronger. Tonight, she would get the evidence needed to change everything. She just didn't know how personal that evidence would become. Officer Wallace Reed had been a cop for 15 years, and somewhere between year 3 and year 4, he'd stopped seeing people and started seeing problems. It hadn't happened all at once. Idealism rarely dies dramatically. It bleeds out slowly, shift by shift, complaint by complaint, until one day you look at a human being and see only the paperwork they represent. At 42, Reed was a veteran of the Riverside District Precinct, known among his colleagues for his results. Streets stayed clear on his watch. Vagrancy complaints dropped. Business owners appreciated his efficiency. The fact that multiple complaints against him had been filed, and quietly buried in his personnel file, was something the department preferred not to examine too closely. Results, after all, mattered more than methods in a city where appearances determined funding. He'd learned Spanish from his ex-wife Rosa, during the 5 years of their marriage before it collapsed under the weight of his growing cynicism and her inability to recognize the man he'd become. The language had been a bridge between them once, a way to connect with her family, to show respect for her heritage. Now it was a weapon, a secret code he used to mock and humiliate people who reminded him too much of the in-laws who'd never thought he was good enough for their daughter. The irony never occurred to him. Or if it did, he'd stopped caring. Officer George Bloomfield, 28 years old and 4 years into his career, sat in the passenger seat watching Reed with a mixture of admiration and discomfort he'd never quite learned to reconcile. Reed was everything Bloomfield wanted to be: confident, respected by senior officers, unbothered by the moral ambiguities that kept Bloomfield awake some nights. But Reed was also everything Bloomfield feared he might become: hard, dismissive, treating their badge as permission rather than responsibility. Bloomfield's Spanish was rudimentary at best, learned in high school and barely retained, but he'd picked up enough crude phrases from Reed to participate in the mockery that had become their routine. It made him feel included, part of the team, even as something in his gut twisted each time they did it. But speaking up would mean isolation, would mean admitting weakness, would mean failing to be the kind of cop Reed had assured him the job required. So he laughed when Reed laughed, and stayed silent when silence was safer than conscience. "Another night in paradise," Reed said as they began their evening patrol, his tone carrying the particular sarcasm of someone who'd convinced himself that cynicism was wisdom. The patrol car rolled through the Riverside district, past closed businesses and scattered individuals who made themselves scarce at the sight of the black and white vehicle. "Got reports about the community center area again," Bloomfield said, checking his tablet. "Residents complaining about homeless camping on the steps." "Always complaining about something," Reed muttered. "These people act like public property is their personal campground. Someone needs to teach them respect." He glanced at his partner with a smirk. "Watch me handle this one. I'll have them cleared out in 5 minutes." Bloomfield laughed, that nervous, performative laugh that had become his default response to Reed's pronouncements. Inside, something whispered that handling people shouldn't sound like a threat, but he pushed the thought down where all his other uncomfortable thoughts lived. The patrol car turned onto the street fronting the Riverside Community Center, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Reed's eyes scanned the area with practiced efficiency, cataloging potential problems. A few people moving away quickly, a shopping cart abandoned near a dumpster, and there on the concrete steps of the shuttered building, a figure that made him slow the vehicle. "Perfect," Reed said, his voice carrying satisfaction. "Let's make an example. Clear these steps, and the rest will get the message." The patrol car slowed to a crawl, its headlights focusing on the woman sitting on the steps like a spotlight finding its target. Tiffany kept her eyes downcast, her posture hunched, maintaining the role she'd perfected over 3 days. But inside, her heart rate accelerated. She'd been briefed on Reed and Bloomfield. She knew their pattern. She knew what was coming. This was why she was here. The patrol car stopped with a deliberate pause, engine idling, letting the moment stretch. The sound of car doors opening echoed through the quiet street. Reed stepped out first, Bloomfield following a half-second behind, their movements choreographed by routine, hands resting on their belts near their weapons, stance wide and dominant, faces arranged in expressions that said they were in charge and everyone else existed at their discretion. Reed's smirk was already forming, that particular expression of someone about to enjoy themselves at another person's expense. He approached with a swagger of unchecked authority, his boots heavy on the pavement, each step a small assertion of power. Tiffany's hand found the hidden pocket in her jacket, fingers brushing against the diplomatic credentials that could end this moment whenever she chose. Her other hand touched the wire device disguised as a button, ensuring it was recording. Every word, every tone, every moment of what was about to unfold. In the periphery, she saw other homeless individuals melting into shadows, disappearing into doorways and around corners with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned that being present when police arrived rarely ended well. Maria's warning from earlier echoed, "When you see Reed's car, you vanish." He's not one of the good ones. None of them were vanishing to help her. They were vanishing to survive. She understood. She didn't blame them. Reed stopped a few feet away, looking down at her with an expression that mixed contempt with something uglier, satisfaction. He'd found tonight's entertainment. ¿Qué pasa, señora? The Spanish came out dripping with mockery, each syllable deliberately exaggerated, the tone making it clear this wasn't a question but a taunt. Tiffany kept her eyes down, her breathing steady despite the rage beginning to build in her chest. 3 days of documentation. 3 days of holding her tongue. Not yet. Let them show exactly who they are. Bloomfield positioned himself to Reed's right, his hand also on his belt, mirroring his partner's stance even as something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable. But comfort mattered less than conformity, and he'd learned that lesson well. Reed turned slightly toward his partner, his voice shifting to rapid Spanish that he clearly believed was their private language, their secret code for saying things they wouldn't dare say in English where anyone might understand an object. "Mira esta," Reed said, gesturing toward Tiffany with casual disdain. "Look at this one. Another piece of street trash littering our nice clean steps. These people have no shame. No dignity. They just sit wherever they want, expecting the world to accommodate their failure." His Spanish was fluent, gifted to him by a wife who'd loved him before he'd become this person. Now he used that gift to wound people who shared her heritage, and the irony remained invisible to him. Bloomfield laughed, adding his own observations in broken Spanish that mangled pronunciation but conveyed cruelty perfectly. "Look at her clothes. Her hair. Probably smells terrible. But she doesn't even speak English, let alone Spanish. Probably doesn't understand a word we're saying." They laughed together, the sound carrying through the empty street, each chuckle a small act of violence designed to dehumanize and demean. The shared cruelty bonded them, made them feel powerful, made them forget, or perhaps helped them ignore, that their job was to protect everyone, not just people they deemed worthy. Tiffany remained perfectly still, her face calm even as her heart pounded against her ribs. She understood every word, every insult, every assumption. Her Spanish was perfect, not the Spanish of someone who'd learned it as a second language, but the pure Castilian Spanish of someone born in Barcelona, educated at the finest institutions, who'd spent 2 decades representing the Kingdom of Spain to the world. She understood, and she documented. The wire in her jacket captured every syllable. Her mind catalogued every detail, their body language, their tone, their casual assumption that they could mock without consequence because their targets were powerless. But she was thinking of more than documentation now. She was thinking of Maria, who'd endured this treatment for 8 months. Of James, who'd served his country and received this as thanks. Of Sarah, who'd fled violence only to find different violence waiting. Of all the others who'd stood where she stood now, hearing words meant to break their spirit, lacking the power to fight back. Her hand found the diplomatic ID in her inner pocket, fingers tracing its edge. The wire recorded. The body cameras on both officers captured everything from their perspective. The evidence was sufficient. More than sufficient. But something in her wanted them to go further. Wanted them to show, without any possibility of misinterpretation, exactly who they were when they thought no one important was watching. Reed stepped closer, his presence deliberately intimidating. "Let's see some ID," he said, his tone suggesting he already knew she wouldn't have any, that this was just another step in the ritual of humiliation. "You probably don't have any, right? No papers? No documentation." He turned back to Bloomfield, continuing in Spanish. "We should just arrest all of them. Make them someone else's problem. Send them to detention until they learn to stop cluttering up our streets. These people, they're like weeds. You pull them out in one place, they just grow somewhere else." The racist undertones weren't even undertones anymore. They were text, spoken plainly in a language they believed was their secret. Bloomfield shifted uncomfortably, his participation becoming more hesitant even as he couldn't bring himself to stop entirely. Maybe we should just... Should just what? Reed cut him off. Go soft? That's what got this district looking like a refugee camp in the first place. Someone has to have the backbone to clean it up. He looked back at Tiffany, his hand now resting near his handcuffs. Should probably arrest her just for existing. Make it vagrancy, loitering, whatever sticks. The suggestion hung in the air, arrest without cause, detention without crime, punishment for the offense of being visible while poor. Reed leaned down slightly, his voice taking on a mocking tone. ¿Habla español? Do you speak Spanish? The question was rhetorical, designed to further humiliate, to highlight what he believed was her ignorance. Then he turned to Bloomfield with a smirk, speaking in Spanish that he was certain only his partner understood. Mira esta mujer. Probablemente en ni siquiera tiene documentos. Deberíamos arrestarla por. Look at this woman. Probably doesn't even have documents. We should arrest her for. And Tiffany Moreno, Spanish ambassador to the United States, made her decision. 3 days of silence. 3 days of documentation. 3 days of experiencing what thousands endured daily, of feeling dignity stripped away by casual cruelty, of understanding in her bones what reports and statistics could never convey. It ended now. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her diplomatic credentials in her pocket, feeling the wire recording every moment, feeling the truth that was about to shatter these men's world like a stone through glass. With 3 words that would change everything. Tiffany's fingers touched the diplomatic credentials in her pocket one final time, feeling the embossed seal through the leather. This moment had been inevitable from the second she'd accepted the mission, but now that it had arrived, she felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders like a mantle. This wasn't just about her. It had never been about her. This was for Maria, who'd been mocked in Spanish she pretended not to understand because understanding would have meant acknowledging cruelty she couldn't fight back against. For James, who'd served his country and received contempt as payment. For Sarah, whose children had watched their mother treated as less than human. For every person who'd stood where she stood now, hearing words designed to break their spirit, lacking the power to respond, forced to swallow indignity until it became a permanent taste in their mouths. The evidence was gathered. 3 days of documentation captured on wire and body cameras. Their cruelty recorded in their own voices, their own words, their own casual assumption that they could abuse power without consequence because their victims were invisible. The perfect moment. The perfect crime. The perfect opportunity for justice. Reed was still mid-sentence, his Spanish flowing easily. Arrestarla por, arrest her for. Tiffany lifted her head, her eyes meeting Reed's directly for the first time. When she spoke, her voice cut through their laughter like a blade through silk, quiet, clear, and absolutely unmistakable. Yo soy embajadora. 3 words. I am an ambassador. Her Spanish wasn't the Spanish of high school classes or language apps. It wasn't even the Spanish of fluent second language speakers. It was pure Castilian Spanish, the accent of Barcelona royalty and diplomatic halls, educated and unmistakable, carrying centuries of linguistic heritage in every syllable. The Spanish of someone born to it, raised in it, who'd spent a lifetime wielding language as both bridge and weapon. The street seemed to hold its breath. Reed and Bloomfield froze mid-laugh, their expressions caught between amusement and confusion, like actors who'd suddenly forgotten their lines. Reed's mouth remained open, his smirk beginning to falter at the edges. Bloomfield's nervous laughter died in his throat, replaced by something that looked like the first whisper of understanding and fear. What did she just say? Bloomfield asked, his voice uncertain. Reed's brain was processing, trying to reconcile the words he'd just heard with the image before him. The homeless woman on the steps. The perfect Spanish. The tone that carried authority like a title. His smirk wavered, then cracked, then disappeared entirely. Bloomfield took half a step backward, instinct warning him that something had shifted fundamentally, that the script they'd been following had just been rewritten in a language he was only beginning to understand. Tiffany rose from the concrete steps. The movement was deliberate, controlled, unhurried, the kind of rising that couldn't be rushed because it carried the weight of revelation. She straightened slowly, shedding the hunched posture of survival like a coat she no longer needed. Her shoulders rolled back. Her spine aligned. Her chin lifted. In 3 seconds, she transformed from invisible to unavoidable. Despite the worn jacket and dirty jeans, despite the weathered hands and unwashed hair, authority radiated from her like heat from a flame. It wasn't the clothes that made her powerful. It had never been the clothes. It was the truth she carried, the dignity that couldn't be stripped away by circumstance, the unbreakable core that 3 days of cold and hunger and cruelty had only tempered into something harder. In that moment, the costume didn't matter. The dirt on her clothes didn't matter. What mattered was the truth she carried like a torch, and that truth was about to illuminate everything these men had tried to hide in the darkness of a language they believed was their secret weapon. Slowly, she said in English, her voice calm and steady as she reached toward her inner jacket pocket. Reed's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, years of training overriding rational thought. But something in her posture, in her tone, in the absolute confidence of her movement made him stop. His hand hovered, uncertain, as some primal part of his brain recognized that he was no longer in control of the situation. From her pocket, Tiffany pulled a leather credential holder, somehow still pristine despite 3 days on the streets, protected as carefully as the truth it represented. She held it for a moment, letting them see it, letting the anticipation build, understanding that the reveal would be more devastating if she let them imagine for one more second what it might contain. Then she flipped it open under the streetlight. Gold caught the light. The seal of the Kingdom of Spain, intricate, official, unmistakable, gleamed against the leather. Beside it, her photograph, professional, polished, powerful. The same face that now looked at them from the steps, but transformed by context, by clothing, by the trappings of authority that made visible what had always been present. Her name in embossed letters, Ambassador Tiffany Moreno. Her title below it, Spanish Ambassador to the United States of America. Additional lines detailing diplomatic immunity status, security clearances, access levels that put her on the same playing field as senators and cabinet secretaries. Bloomfield's face drained of color so rapidly he looked physically ill. The blood seemed to leave his body all at once, taking with it every bit of confidence, every scrap of swagger, every particle of the persona he built around being tough and in control. Reed's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No words came out. His brain was frantically trying to process, to find some explanation, some way to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. The homeless woman. The ambassador. The 3 days of mockery. The diplomatic credentials. The catastrophic, career-ending, life-destroying mistake. Tiffany switched to English, her voice steady and clear, each word measured for maximum impact. I understand every word you said. Pause. Let it sink in. Every insult. Pause. Every dehumanizing comment. Pause. Every assumption you made about my worth based on how I looked. She let the pauses stretch, let each statement land like a stone into still water, the ripples spreading outward, touching everything, changing everything. Reed tried to speak, his mouth forming shapes that might have been words in some universe where his brain was still functioning. Ambassador, we thought. You thought I couldn't understand, Tiffany finished for him, her tone not angry but factual, which somehow made it more devastating. You thought Spanish was your secret language. You thought you could mock me, dehumanize me, treat me as less than human, and there would be no consequences because I was invisible. Powerless. Beneath your notice. Bloomfield was shaking now, his hands trembling at his sides, his career flashing before his eyes in terrible clarity. 4 years of work. 4 years of building a reputation. 4 years about to be erased by one night, one woman, one catastrophic error in judgment. Reed looked like he'd aged a decade in seconds, the lines around his eyes deepening, his posture collapsing inward as the full weight of his mistake crashed over him like a wave. For 3 days, Tiffany continued, her voice never rising, remaining calm and controlled in a way that made it infinitely more powerful than shouting ever could be. I've walked in shoes you've never had to wear. I've felt the stares, the dismissals, the casual cruelty. I've slept on cold concrete. I've gone hungry. I've been told to move along from every place I tried to rest. I've been followed by security guards, refused bathroom access, treated like garbage by people who decided my worth based on my appearance. She took a step closer to them, and despite being unarmed, despite being smaller than either officer, she seemed to fill the space with authority that made them shrink. And tonight, you've given me the clearest evidence of what thousands have reported, that some officers abuse their power to terrorize the most vulnerable. That some people with badges believe their authority makes them superior rather than responsible. That systemic discrimination isn't just policy failing, it's individuals choosing cruelty. Ambassador, please, Reed tried again, but Tiffany raised her hand slightly, and he fell silent like a student before a headmaster. I'm not finished, she said, and the quiet authority in those 3 words commanded absolute obedience. She reached to her collar, her fingers finding the small device disguised as a button. Your body cameras are recording this conversation. Everything that's happened in the last 10 minutes is documented from your perspective, in your equipment, with your own audio. She held up the wire device for them to see. My wire has been recording everything for 3 days. 72 hours of audio. Every conversation I've had. Every interaction with police, security guards, business owners. Every story from people like Maria, James, and Sarah, people whose names you never bothered to learn, whose humanity you never bothered to recognize. Each revelation fell like a hammer blow. Reed's face moved through expressions too quickly to catalog: denial, bargaining, anger, despair. Bloomfield looked like he might physically collapse, his knees seeming to buckle slightly. Tomorrow morning, Tiffany continued, her tone still that terrible, calm factuality, your precinct captain will receive a full report detailing everything I've documented. Along with it will be a formal diplomatic complaint filed with the State Department, the Department of Justice, and the Office of the Spanish Ambassador, which is to say me. She paused, letting them imagine the chain of events: internal affairs investigations, media coverage, diplomatic incidents, career destruction, public humiliation. I could have you arrested right now, she said. Diplomatic harassment is a federal offense. Abuse of power, civil rights violations, intimidation, creating a hostile environment based on perceived socio-economic status. The charges write themselves. Hope flickered briefly in Reed's eyes. Could have, past tense, maybe she wouldn't, but Tiffany's next words extinguished it. But that would be too easy. Her tone shifted, moving from prosecutor to something more complex. Teacher, judge, someone offering a choice between destruction and transformation. Arrest would be quick. You'd be gone, replaced by other officers, and nothing would fundamentally change. The system that enabled you would continue. The culture that encouraged you would persist. You'd become scapegoats, and everyone else would claim they're different. They'd never do what you did. She looked at both of them, making sure they understood what she was about to say. Instead, you're going to learn. You're going to attend every diversity training, every homelessness awareness course, every seminar on implicit bias and abuse of power that your department offers. You're going to volunteer at homeless shelters. You're going to serve meals at soup kitchens. You're going to hear the stories of people like Maria, who can't get an ID because she doesn't have an address and can't get an address because she doesn't have an ID. People like James, who served in Afghanistan and came home to a VA system that treats his PTSD like paperwork. People like Sarah, who fled violence with her children and found the shelters full and the system designed for people who already have stability. Her voice remained steady, each word chosen carefully, deliberately. You're going to understand. truly understand the humanity you've been dismissing. And every single time you put on that uniform, you're going to remember this moment. You're going to remember that the woman you tried to humiliate was more powerful than you ever imagined. She paused, then added the most important part. But more importantly, you're going to remember that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their circumstances. That dignity isn't determined by bank accounts or addresses. That your badge is a responsibility to protect everyone, not just people you deem worthy. Movement in the periphery caught the edge of Tiffany's vision. Other homeless individuals were emerging from the shadows where they'd hidden when the patrol car arrived. Maria stood near a doorway, her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with something that looked like vindication mixed with disbelief. James stood beside her, his military posture returning as if witnessing justice had reminded him of the code he'd once served under. Sarah watched from behind them, tears streaming down her face. Several of them had their phones out, filming, documenting, ensuring that this moment would be recorded not just on official equipment, but in the hands of witnesses who'd lived what Tiffany had only experienced for 3 days. Traffic was slowing. Pedestrians were stopping. The confrontation that had started in relative privacy was now public, witnessed, documented. The humiliation Reed had intended to inflict on Tiffany was being reflected back at him, magnified, broadcast, permanent. Word would spread. By morning, everyone would know. The officers who used Spanish as a weapon. The ambassador who'd gone undercover. The moment justice arrived in a form no one had expected. Tiffany took one more breath, preparing to deliver her final statement. The words that would define this moment, that would be quoted in reports and repeated in training sessions, that would become part of the story of how one city began to change. Dignity isn't something you can strip away with insults, she said, her voice carrying across the street, reaching the witnesses, the phones, the body cameras, the future. It's inherent. It's human. It's sacred. Every person carries it, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of how society has failed them, regardless of how many people like you have tried to take it from them. She looked directly at Reed, then Bloomfield, making sure they understood. You forgot that. You forgot that the badge you wear is supposed to protect dignity, not assault it. You forgot that power without accountability becomes tyranny. You forgot that everyone you encounter is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend, someone who matters. Her voice dropped slightly, becoming almost gentle, which somehow made it more devastating. And it will cost you everything. The words hung in the November air like a sentence being passed. As Tiffany stood under the streetlight, diplomatic credentials in hand, worn jacket still carrying 3 days of cold and dirt, she wasn't just an ambassador representing Spain. She was a voice for every person these officers had belittled, every human being they'd treated as invisible, every soul whose dignity had been assaulted by people who'd forgotten that their job was to serve and protect everyone, not just those they deemed worthy. And her voice, quiet but unshakable, carried the weight of justice finally arriving, delayed perhaps but never denied. Swift when it came, and absolutely, devastatingly sweet. The patrol car sat silent under the streetlight, its engine still running, exhaust curling into the November air like visible regret. Inside, Reed and Bloomfield remained frozen in their seats, unable to leave, unable to speak, trapped between the world they'd known 10 minutes ago and the one that now waited for them with consequences they couldn't yet fully comprehend. Tiffany stood outside, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in low, rapid Spanish to her State Department contact. Around her, witnesses maintained their distance but their presence, their phones still recording, their eyes still watching, ensured that this moment would be preserved, documented, undeniable. Confirmed, she said into the phone, switching to English. 3-day operation complete. Evidence secured. Request immediate backup and IA presence. Yes, I'm fine. No, they didn't touch me. But they would have, given time. That's the point. Backup arrived in 7 minutes, though it felt like hours. 2 patrol cars from a different precinct, their presence deliberate. No one from Riverside District could be trusted with this situation, not yet, not until the investigation had run its course. Behind them came a black SUV that Tiffany recognized, Captain James Morrison, East District, known for his integrity and his zero tolerance for corruption. Morrison emerged from his vehicle like judgment taking physical form. A man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough in 30 years of police work to recognize a catastrophe when he encountered one. He took in the scene with practiced efficiency. The patrol car with 2 officers inside looking shell-shocked, the homeless woman in worn clothing holding diplomatic credentials, the witnesses with phones, the whole tableau of a career-ending mistake. "Ambassador Moreno," he said, his voice carrying professional respect mixed with barely concealed horror at what he was about to hear. "I was briefed on your operation. I'm very sorry about what you've experienced." "Don't be sorry," Tiffany replied, her voice steady. "Be effective. This needs to end with systemic change, not just individual consequences." Within minutes, the scene transformed into a formal investigation site. Body camera footage was secured from both Reed and Bloomfield's equipment, copied immediately to multiple secure locations, ensuring no one could claim technical failures or lost evidence. Tiffany handed over her wire device, its 72 hours of recordings containing not just tonight's confrontation, but 3 days of documented discrimination. Morrison approached the patrol car where Reed and Bloomfield still sat. When he opened the driver's side door, his face carried no sympathy, no collegial understanding, no hint of the brotherhood that sometimes protected officers from consequences. "Weapons and badges," he said simply. "Suspended immediately without pay, pending internal affairs investigation." Reed's hand trembled as he unholstered his service weapon, handing it over along with his badge. 15 years of service, reduced to metal and leather in Morrison's hands. Bloomfield followed suit, his face pale, his movements mechanical, like a man in shock. "You're both being separated for individual questioning," Morrison continued. "Internal Affairs has been notified. FBI liaison is being contacted per diplomatic incident protocols. You'll be read your rights. You may want to call your union representatives." "Captain," Reed started, his voice carrying the particular desperation of someone watching their world collapse, "we were just—" "Don't," Morrison cut him off, his tone sharp. "Don't say anything until your lawyer is present." "And Officer Reed? I've seen the preliminary footage. Whatever you were just doing, it ends your career here. Maybe more than your career." Movement at the edge of the scene drew attention. Cars slowing, people gathering, phones out and recording. Word had already spread. The witness videos had already gone viral, bouncing through social media with a particular velocity of content that confirms what people already believed but rarely got to see proven, that power could be abused, that the vulnerable were targeted, that sometimes, just sometimes, justice arrived in unexpected forms. A black diplomatic vehicle pulled up, and someone emerged with a garment bag and a sealed case. Tiffany's real clothes. Her real life, waiting to be reclaimed. She changed in the back of the SUV, stripping away the worn jacket and dirty jeans, washing her face with bottled water and cleaning wipes, watching 3 days of grime disappear but feeling the memories remain, permanently etched into her understanding of the world. When she emerged 10 minutes later, she looked like herself again, elegant blazer, tailored pants, hair pulled back into a professional bun. Ambassador Moreno returned from an undercover assignment that would change federal policy. But the bruises on her ribs from sleeping on concrete remained. The exhaustion in her bones from 3 nights without real sleep remained. The memory of Maria's quiet dignity, James's protective vigilance, Sarah's desperate hope, all of it remained, transformed from abstract concern into visceral understanding. The internal affairs interview took place in Morrison's vehicle, recorded on multiple devices, witnessed by a State Department representative who'd arrived within the hour. Tiffany's statement was comprehensive, detailed, devastating. She walked them through every moment of the 3-day operation, every interaction, every indignity, every pattern of discrimination she'd witnessed. The wire recordings were reviewed. Reed and Bloomfield's voices, captured in their own words, speaking Spanish they believed was a secret language, mocking and dehumanizing someone they'd assumed was powerless to respond. The body camera footage confirmed everything: angles, context, undeniable evidence. In separate rooms at the precinct, Reed and Bloomfield faced their own reckonings. Reed started defensive, his decades of experience giving him a script to follow. We were just doing our job. Keeping the streets clear. Residents had complained about vagrants camping at the community center. We were responding to community concerns. By mocking a woman in Spanish, the IA investigator asked. By suggesting arrest without probable cause? By calling her street trash and suggesting detention just for existing? Reed stopped, watching his own body camera footage on the screen before him. Watching himself approach with swagger. Watching himself mock. Watching himself suggest illegal detention. Seeing himself through others' eyes. Through the eyes of the woman he'd tried to humiliate. Through the eyes of the camera that had recorded everything. Through the eyes of a system that could no longer protect him. His career imploded in real time, frame by frame, word by word. 15 years of service, destroyed by one night of casual cruelty. The anger came first, at being caught, at being recorded, at the unfairness of facing consequences when he'd only been doing what others did, what the culture tacitly encouraged. Then the anger gave way to despair as reality settled in. There was no escape from this evidence, no talking his way out, no union protection strong enough to save him. In the adjacent room, Bloomfield's response was immediate and total collapse. I didn't want to, I was following. The words came out broken, tears already streaming down his face. That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. But it is what you did, the investigator said, not unkindly. 4 years on the force, and this is what you chose. He's my training officer. I thought, Bloomfield's voice cracked. I thought that's what the job required. Being tough. Not letting them take advantage. I knew it was wrong, I knew it felt wrong, but I never spoke up. I never said stop. The genuine remorse was apparent, mixed with self-preservation, mixed with the dawning horror of a young man realizing he'd become something he'd never intended to be. At 28, his career was likely over. But unlike Reed, who'd hardened into what he was, Bloomfield seemed malleable still, capable of transformation if given the chance. I'm sorry, he said, looking directly at the camera, as if speaking to Tiffany herself. I'm so sorry. You're right. About everything. I forgot, or maybe I never really understood, that everyone deserves dignity. Please. Give me a chance to be better. I'll do whatever it takes. While Reed and Bloomfield gave their statements, the world outside was transforming. The witness videos had gone viral within the first hour. By hour 2, #DignityFirst was trending nationally. By hour 3, every major news outlet had picked up the story. Spanish ambassador goes undercover as homeless, exposes police brutality. The footage of Tiffany revealing her credentials, of Reed and Bloomfield's faces draining of color, of her calm, devastating statement about dignity, it played on loop across every platform. The Spanish government issued a statement before midnight, fully supporting Ambassador Moreno's investigation and commending her courage. The State Department followed shortly after, announcing a full federal investigation into treatment of homeless populations in American cities, with $2 billion in funding contingent on meaningful reform. Local news vans arrived at the precinct. Protesters began gathering, holding signs, "Dignity first, badge equals responsibility, we see you now." Some counter-protesters appeared too, defending the officers. They were just doing their jobs, she entrapped them. But their voices were drowned out by the larger chorus demanding accountability. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers. Think pieces about systemic discrimination. Deeper conversations about homelessness, about how society treats its most vulnerable, about the casual cruelty that happened every day but rarely got documented, rarely got punished. The movement Tiffany had ignited was growing by the hour. By 2 a.m., Tiffany finally returned to her Georgetown townhouse. The black SUV dropped her at her door, security ensuring she made it inside safely. The house felt foreign after 3 days, the warmth almost oppressive, the silence almost eerie, the softness of everything contrasting sharply with concrete and cold and constant vigilance. She stood in her bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror. Ambassador Moreno, cleaned up, put back together. But underneath the blazer, bruises bloomed purple and yellow across her ribs from sleeping on hard surfaces. Her feet were blistered. Her body ached in ways that luxury mattresses and hot showers couldn't immediately fix. She showered for 30 minutes, washing away the physical grime but unable to wash away the memories. Maria's face when Tiffany had shared her last piece of bread. James's protective stance, still trying to serve and protect despite the system that had failed him. Sarah's tears when someone finally treated her like she mattered. The investigation had been about more than documentation. It had been about understanding, truly understanding, what policy looked like when it became personal, what discrimination felt like when you lived inside it, what dignity meant when it was all you had left. Sleep was impossible. Tiffany sat at her desk, laptop open, and began compiling her report. Not just Reed and Bloomfield's actions, though those were documented in excruciating detail, but the systemic patterns she'd observed. The security guards who followed. The restaurants that refused bathroom access. The stores that treated poverty as theft. The social services overwhelmed and understaffed. The bureaucratic loops that trapped people. Can't get ID without address. Can't get address without ID. Can't get job without either. Every indignity she'd witnessed went into the report. Every story she'd heard. Maria's medical bankruptcy and eviction. James's PTSD and VA bureaucracy. Sarah's domestic violence and full shelters. The elderly man who'd worked construction for 40 years until arthritis and age made him unemployable. The young woman with schizophrenia who'd fallen through cracks in the mental health system. Her recommendations were comprehensive: housing-first approaches, integrated social services, police training that emphasized connection over enforcement, mental health resources, job programs, and fundamentally, a shift in how society viewed homelessness. Not as moral failure, but as policy failure. Not as problem to be hidden, but as crisis to be addressed. Personal observations filled the final section: how quickly dignity could be stripped away, how invisibility felt like a physical weight, how humanity persisted even in the harshest circumstances, how the measure of a society truly was how it treated its most vulnerable. Her phone vibrated constantly. Messages from fellow ambassadors offering support. The Spanish Prime Minister checking on her well-being. Media requests that her assistant was already filtering. State Department scheduling a press conference for the following afternoon. The Riverside District Precinct captain requesting an urgent meeting. And messages from people she'd never met. Homeless individuals seeing the news, coming forward with their own stories, finding courage in her revelation to share experiences they'd thought no one would believe or care about. Before dawn, Tiffany called the Homeless Services Coordinator and tracked down Maria, James, and Sarah. She ensured they had temporary housing, access to resources, legal representation if they wanted it. But more than that, she asked them to be part of the official record. "Your stories matter," she told Maria over the phone, hearing the elderly woman's tears through the line. "You're not just background in my report. You're the reason for the report." "You spoke for us when we had no voice," Maria said, her voice breaking. "Nobody ever stood up before. Nobody with power ever cared enough to see us as human." "I see you," Tiffany replied. "And now, everyone else will too." James agreed to testify before Congress if needed. Sarah became a key witness for the Justice Department investigation. Their faces, their stories, their dignity, all of it would be part of the record, part of the change that was coming. Legal machinations were already in motion. The police union activated Reed's defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. Reed retained a lawyer, preparing to fight, but even his attorney advised that the best outcome would be quiet resignation. Bloomfield's lawyer advised cooperation, sensing that his client's youth and genuine remorse might offer a path to redemption through transformation rather than just punishment. Federal civil rights violations were on the table. Diplomatic incident protocols were activated. The city attorney's office went into damage control mode, already calculating settlement costs. As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., painting the monuments in shades of gold and pink, Tiffany stood on her balcony overlooking Georgetown. The wealth and privilege of her neighborhood were starkly visible. Manicured gardens, elegant townhouses, the kind of security that came from never having to worry about where you'd sleep. 3 days ago, she'd been invisible on cold streets. Tonight, the whole world was watching. She understood now that the revelation had been the easy part. Exposing the problem was simple compared to fixing it. But she had something powerful now: truth, evidence, and a nation's attention. She intended to use all three. The real work was just beginning. The State Department auditorium was packed beyond capacity, media credentials checked and rechecked, cameras positioned to capture every angle. Director Patricia Hawthorne stood at the podium with the particular gravity of someone about to confirm what the world had already seen in viral videos but needed to hear officially, formally, with the weight of institutional authority behind it. Beside her stood Ambassador Tiffany Moreno in full diplomatic attire, navy blue suit with the Spanish flag pin on her lapel, hair perfectly styled, posture radiating the authority that 3 days on the streets hadn't diminished but had somehow made more authentic, more earned. 48 hours ago, Patricia began, her voice carrying across the hushed auditorium, Ambassador Moreno completed a 3-day undercover operation documenting the treatment of homeless populations in Washington, D.C. What you're about to see is footage from the body cameras of 2 officers who believed they could abuse their power without consequence. The lights dimmed. The screens flickered to life. The footage played without commentary, didn't need commentary. Reed's swagger. His mocking Spanish. Bloomfield's participation. The casual cruelty. The suggestion of arrest without cause. Then Tiffany's voice, cutting through their laughter, "Yo soy embajadora." Gasps rippled through the auditorium, even though most had already seen clips online. But seeing it here, officially, with context and full audio, made it more devastating. Watching the officers' faces drain of color. Watching power shift in real time. Watching justice arrive in 3 words and a diplomatic ID. When the lights came back up, several reporters were wiping their eyes. Patricia stepped aside, and Tiffany approached the podium. She spoke first in English, then repeated key points in Spanish, her voice steady but carrying the weight of lived experience rather than abstract policy. "I didn't just document a problem," she said, her hands resting on the podium, her eyes meeting cameras directly. "I lived it. For 3 days, I experienced what millions of Americans experience every day: being made invisible, being treated as less than human, being told to move along from every place I tried to rest. I felt hunger that made thinking difficult. Cold that made sleeping impossible. Dignity stripped away by people who decided my worth based on my appearance." She paused, letting the room absorb it. This isn't about 2 officers. This is about a system that enabled them. A culture that encouraged them. A society that looked away while our most vulnerable were harassed, mocked, and dehumanized. The comprehensive report being released today contains detailed recommendations for reform, not just in law enforcement but in housing policy, social services, mental health support, and fundamentally, in how we view homelessness itself. The questions came rapid fire. "Ambassador Moreno, weren't you in danger?" "Every homeless person is in danger every night," Tiffany replied. "I had the privilege of knowing my danger was temporary. They don't." What should happen to Officers Reed and Bloomfield? That's for the justice system to determine. What I will say is this: I refuse to demonize individuals while ignoring the system that created them. Reed and Bloomfield made choices, yes. But those choices were made in a culture that tacitly approved of treating homeless populations as problems to be managed rather than citizens to be protected. Did you consider the diplomatic implications? The Spanish government was briefed and supportive. Human rights don't stop being important when they're inconvenient. If my position as ambassador gave me the privilege to document this safely, then using that privilege was my responsibility. A reporter from the back stood. "Can you talk about the people you met? Maria, James, Sarah." Tiffany's composure wavered for the first time, emotion flickering across her face before she controlled it. Maria is a 70-year-old woman who worked as a home health aide until medical bankruptcy made her homeless. She can't get an ID without an address and can't get an address without an ID, trapped in a bureaucratic loop designed for people who already have stability. James is a Marine Corps veteran with a Purple Heart who served his country and came home to a system that treats his PTSD like paperwork. Sarah fled domestic violence with her children and found every shelter full, every door requiring documentation she didn't have. Her voice strengthened. These aren't statistics. They're people. They have names, histories, dignity that no circumstance can erase. And they deserve better than a society that's decided their suffering is acceptable. The clip of Tiffany saying "Yo soy embajadora" had already been viewed 50 million times across platforms by the time the press conference ended. With subtitles, without subtitles, remixed with music, recreated by actors, animated, memed, turned into art. The moment had transcended the incident itself, becoming a symbol of standing up to abuse of power, of revealing hidden truth, of dignity asserting itself against those who tried to strip it away. TikTok videos showed young people recreating the moment. Artists painted Tiffany holding her credentials under streetlight. Musicians sampled her voice. International coverage made her a global figure overnight, the ambassador who'd chosen solidarity over comfort, who'd used privilege as responsibility rather than shield. While Tiffany became a symbol of justice, Reed became a cautionary tale. His personnel file leaked within 24 hours, probably from sources within the department who'd been waiting for an opportunity to expose what leadership had buried. 15 years of complaints revealed: harassment, excessive force, discriminatory language, abuse of authority. Complaints filed and quietly settled, buried in paperwork, explained away as misunderstandings or isolated incidents that formed, when viewed together, an undeniable pattern. Previous incidents covered up by a system more interested in avoiding lawsuits than addressing behavior. The Spanish-language mockery wasn't new. Witnesses came forward describing encounters years earlier, their complaints dismissed because they couldn't prove it, or might have misunderstood. The police union tried to protect him, but the evidence was overwhelming and the public attention was relentless. Within 48 hours, Reed's resignation was pressured, presented as voluntary but understood by everyone as forced. His statement, released through his lawyer, blamed everyone but himself. Cancel culture and political correctness have made it impossible for officers to do their jobs. I served this city for 15 years, and this is how they repay me, throwing me away because I hurt someone's feelings. The ambassador entrapped me. This whole operation was dishonest from the start. No acceptance of responsibility. No recognition of the humanity he dismissed. Just bitterness and blame, the final testament to a man who'd learned nothing from his downfall. Bloomfield chose a different path. His cooperation with investigators was immediate and complete. 48 hours after the confrontation, he released a public apology video, not polished by PR teams, just him sitting in his parents' living room, red-eyed and raw. "I was wrong," he said, looking directly at the camera. "Completely, absolutely wrong. I participated in mocking Ambassador Moreno. I laughed when Officer Reed made cruel comments. I added my own. I knew it felt wrong, and I did it anyway because I wanted to fit in, wanted to be seen as tough, wanted to impress my training officer." His voice cracked. But that's not an excuse. That's an explanation, and there's a difference. I'm responsible for my actions. I'm responsible for every person I treated as less than human while I wore a badge that was supposed to protect everyone. He paused, collecting himself. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to learn, to be better, to spend however long it takes making amends. Ambassador Moreno, Maria, James, Sarah, everyone I failed, you deserve better. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be better. The video went viral too, but for different reasons than Reed's bitter statement. People recognized genuine remorse. The possibility of redemption. The difference between someone who'd lost their way and someone who'd become the way they'd lost. The investigation expanded rapidly. Other victims came forward, dozens, then hundreds, describing similar treatment not just from Reed and Bloomfield but from other officers in the Riverside District Precinct. A pattern emerged: systemic harassment, discriminatory enforcement, abuse of power normalized by a culture that had forgotten its purpose. The precinct captain came under scrutiny for failed oversight. How had 15 years of complaints against Reed been buried? Who'd authorized the cover-ups? Why had the Spanish-language mockery been allowed to continue when multiple reports documented it? Federal civil rights investigations widened. The Department of Justice announced formal involvement. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of homeless plaintiffs, seeking damages and policy reform. The case that had started with one confrontation was becoming a reckoning for an entire system. Inside the precinct, morale shattered along generational lines. Younger officers, horrified by their colleagues' actions, demanded accountability and reform. Veterans, some defensive about culture they'd participated in or enabled, resisted change as attack on all police rather than necessary correction of specific abuses. Emergency meetings devolved into shouting matches about what it meant to serve and protect. The city responded with a speed that only public humiliation and potential federal intervention could inspire. The mayor held emergency meetings. The police chief promised reforms: mandatory body cameras with footage reviewed regularly, cultural sensitivity training with emphasis on Spanish-language competency as connection tool rather than weapon, homelessness liaison program pairing officers with social workers, community oversight board with homeless representatives. Immediate policy changes announced within 48 hours, unprecedented speed that revealed how quickly change could happen when political will existed. The national conversation exploded. Morning shows featured debates between homeless advocates and law enforcement representatives. Late-night hosts made jokes about the officers while highlighting the serious issues underneath. Congress members from both parties proposed legislation. A national homelessness task force was formed, with Tiffany invited to chair it. But behind the public-facing, personal costs mounted. Reed's wife filed for separation. His son changed his social media to remove any association with his father's name. Community ostracism made him unable to show his face in public without recognition, confrontation, shame. He withdrew into isolation, drinking, depression, the consequences he'd avoided for 15 years arriving all at once. Bloomfield moved back with his parents, beginning therapy sessions to understand how he'd become someone he didn't recognize. Some friends stood by him. Others didn't. The shame and guilt were crushing, but unlike Reed, he seemed willing to carry that weight as penance rather than drown it in bitterness. Counter-narratives emerged from predictable sources. Conservative outlets questioned Tiffany's tactics, entrapment, they called it. Dishonest undercover operation. The police union pushed back against what they framed as attacks on all law enforcement rather than accountability for specific abuses. Tiffany responded with facts, with evidence, with the calm authority that had defined her confrontation with Reed and Bloomfield. The public largely supported her. Polls showed 73% approval for the operation, 81% support for reforms. Maria, James, and Sarah became advocates, their faces and stories appearing in media coverage that finally treated homeless individuals as people rather than problems. They shared their experiences publicly, humanizing an issue that policy discussions had abstracted. Temporary housing was arranged. Long-term support organized. But more importantly, they were finally being heard, being seen, having their dignity recognized. In private moments, Tiffany felt the exhaustion of sudden visibility. Calls from around the world. Diplomats reaching out, some supportive, some questioning whether going undercover had been appropriate for an ambassador. The Spanish government backed her fully, but her personal cost was real: increased security, inability to walk streets without recognition, the strange burden of becoming a symbol when she'd only tried to do what was right. But she was already planning the next phase. Meetings with homeless advocacy groups. The Dignity First initiative taking shape, not just exposure but concrete action. Funding organized. Partnerships formed. Timeline for implementation: 6 months to pilot programs in 10 cities, 2 years to national rollout. 48 hours had transformed everything. 2 officers fallen, 1 possibly redeemable, 1 choosing bitterness over growth. A city forced to confront how it treated its most vulnerable. A nation engaged in difficult conversation it had avoided for decades. The easy part was revealing the truth. The hard part would be ensuring that truth led to lasting change. But as Tiffany stood before her window, watching the sun set over a city in turmoil, she knew she wouldn't stop until dignity was restored to every street corner, every cold night, every person society had tried to make invisible. 6 weeks after the confrontation that destroyed his career, Wallace Reed walked out of the police department for the final time. No ceremony. No farewell gathering. No colleagues shaking his hand and wishing him well. Just a back door, a cardboard box with 15 years of desk items, and a pension reduced to the minimum allowable by law. He became a regular at O'Malley's, a dive bar 3 neighborhoods away where no one recognized him or, if they did, had the decency not to mention it. He spent his afternoons there, nursing whiskey and bitterness in equal measure, watching news coverage of the reforms his downfall had triggered and blaming everyone. Tiffany Moreno for her entrapment, the department for abandoning him, cancel culture for destroying good cops, the media for their witch hunt. Everyone except himself. His wife had served divorce papers. His son had legally changed his last name, unwilling to carry the weight of association. Applications to security firms were rejected immediately. His name was too recognizable, his reputation too toxic. The fall was complete, and Reed remained at the bottom, unable to see that the only thing keeping him there was his refusal to climb. George Bloomfield chose a different path. He accepted the demotion without protest, from patrol officer to community liaison, assigned to the homeless outreach program. The first day, he arrived in civilian clothes rather than uniform, meeting with a homeless services coordinator who regarded him with professional courtesy and personal skepticism. "This won't be easy," Patricia Chin told him, a veteran social worker who'd spent 20 years doing the work Bloomfield was only beginning to understand. "They know who you are. They've seen the video. You're the cop who mocked an ambassador and by extension, mocked every one of them." "I know," Bloomfield said quietly. "I deserve whatever they have to say to me." Their first stop was St. Augustine's Soup Kitchen, the same place where Tiffany had eaten watery oatmeal and heard Maria's story. The moment Bloomfield walked through the door, conversation stopped. Eyes turned. Recognition dawned on faces that had learned to be wary of anyone in authority. James stood from his seat, his military posture making him seem taller than he was. "You're the cop. The one who called us garbage in Spanish." Bloomfield didn't look away, didn't make excuses. "Yes. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but I am. Deeply, truly sorry." "Sorry doesn't give me back my dignity," an elderly man said from the corner. "You're right," Bloomfield replied. "Words can't undo what I did. Only actions can. I'm here to try. If you'll let me." The hostility was palpable, the suspicion earned. Bloomfield accepted it as penance, understanding that trust couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned, inch by painful inch. Patricia began teaching him names instead of categories, stories instead of statistics. The woman with schizophrenia wasn't mentally ill homeless, she was Christine, who'd been a teacher before her illness and medications she couldn't afford. The veteran wasn't PTSD case, he was James, Purple Heart recipient who'd served in Afghanistan while Bloomfield was still in high school. James pulled Bloomfield aside one day, his voice low and controlled. "You know what hurt most? You called me garbage. In Spanish. Like my grandmother spoke. Like the language my family taught me was just a weapon for mockery." Bloomfield's shame was physical, a weight in his chest. "I can't undo it. I can't make it right. But I can help you navigate the VA system if you'll let me. Get you that appointment you've been waiting months for. It took 3 weeks of phone calls, paperwork, and bureaucratic persistence, but Bloomfield finally secured James's VA appointment and housing voucher. The small victory felt monumental, not because it fixed everything, but because it proved that actions could matter more than words. Maria's impact on Bloomfield was profound and transformative. She reminded him of his own abuela, who'd immigrated from Mexico and worked 2 jobs to help raise him. The same grandmother whose language he'd used as a weapon against people like her. I mocked your appearance, he told Maria during one of their appointments to help her secure an ID and SSI benefits. Called you pathetic. While wearing a badge meant to protect you. Maria looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to waste energy on sustained anger. You did. And it hurt. But you're here now. You're trying. That matters. When her permanent housing was finally approved, a small studio apartment that represented the first stable housing she'd had in 9 months, Bloomfield helped her move in. As he assembled her donated furniture, emotion overwhelmed him. He sat on the floor, tears streaming down his face, while Maria, the woman he'd mocked, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, she said softly. It's choosing to see who you're becoming, not who you were. While Bloomfield's personal redemption unfolded, Tiffany's Dignity First initiative launched with $50 million in federal funding. Pilot programs in 10 cities paired law enforcement with social workers, creating correspondence teams for homeless encounters. The paradigm shifted from enforcement to connection, from punishment to support. The training programs were revolutionary. Officers were encouraged to spend 24 hours in voluntary homeless simulations, sleeping rough, being told to move along, experiencing the invisibility and indignity. Many refused. Some embraced the opportunity and emerged transformed. But the most powerful training came from homeless individuals teaching the classes. Maria, James, and Sarah stood before rooms full of officers, sharing their stories without anger, offering their humanity without reservation. Officers who'd seen homeless populations as problems heard them as people. Parents, veterans, survivors, human beings caught in circumstances that could happen to anyone. Attitudes began shifting, slowly but measurably. The national impact was seismic. DOJ investigation findings documented patterns of discrimination in over 30 cities. Consent decrees required systemic reforms. Police departments across the nation implemented versions of the Dignity First model. Tiffany testified before Congress, her 3-day experience giving weight to policy recommendations that might otherwise have been dismissed as theoretical. Legislation passed, the Homeless Bill of Rights, establishing federal protections and funding for comprehensive support services. 6 months into his outreach assignment, Bloomfield had become someone his younger self wouldn't recognize. He no longer sought redemption, he simply served. His relationships with the homeless community were genuine, built on consistent action rather than performative apology. He advocated at city council meetings, pushing for more resources. He spoke at the police academy, telling cadets, "I was everything wrong with policing. Here's how I'm trying to be better." His friendship with Maria developed into a grandmother-grandson dynamic, her wisdom guiding his transformation through weekly coffee meetings at a diner that had once refused her bathroom access but now welcomed her warmly. Sarah's journey paralleled the broader transformation. Tiffany's intervention had changed her trajectory, permanent housing secured, job training completed, children thriving in stable environment. She spoke publicly about homelessness, her testimony at city council meetings powerful and moving. Ambassador Moreno didn't just expose officers. She exposed our society's failures. Now we have a chance to be better. James's progress was equally remarkable. VA benefits approved, PTSD treatment accessed, permanent housing in a veterans program secured. He now worked at the Homeless Services Center, using his experience to help others navigate systems designed to exclude. Speaking to veterans groups, he often said, "If an ambassador can spend 3 days in my shoes, Maybe we all need to walk in each other's shoes. Reed watched it all from his small apartment. The news coverage of reforms, Bloomfield praised for his transformation, lives being changed while his remained defined by bitterness. His wife served final divorce papers. His son's name change became official. Jealousy mixed with regret mixed with anger, all of it poisoned by his refusal to accept responsibility. He'd become the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when someone chooses blame over growth. Policy changes implemented across the city reflected the paradigm shift. New procedures for homeless encounters emphasizing connection over enforcement, Spanish language requirements focused on cultural competency rather than mockery, body camera footage reviewed regularly by community oversight boards that included homeless representatives. Success was measured by connections to services rather than arrests, a fundamental reimagining of what public safety meant. 1 year after that November night, a ceremony was held at the Riverside Community Center. The building had been renovated, transformed into a resource hub offering services, support, and most importantly dignity. The steps where Tiffany had sat were now marked with a plaque, Site of Transformation, where 3 words changed everything. The auditorium was packed. Tiffany stood at the podium in the same elegant style that had marked her diplomatic career, but something in her bearing had changed, tempered by experience, strengthened by purpose. "A year ago, I sat on those steps outside, pretending to be invisible," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Tonight, I see a community that refuses to let anyone be invisible. That refuses to accept that any human being is disposable, forgettable, or less deserving of dignity." Maria, James, and Sarah sat on stage beside her, their presence testament to transformation. Statistics were shared. Arrests down 70%, service connections up 200%, permanent housing placements tripled. But more than numbers, stories were shared, individual lives changed, families reunited, dignity restored. Bloomfield sat in the audience, quietly supportive, no longer seeking spotlight or redemption but simply witnessing the change he'd become part of. After the ceremony, he stood on the community center steps, the exact spot where he'd mocked Tiffany, where his world had collapsed and his opportunity for transformation had begun. Maria joined him, understanding without words why he'd returned to this place. "You're not that person anymore," she said gently. "No," Bloomfield agreed. "But I never forget that person. He keeps me honest. Keeps me working. Keeps me remembering why this matters." They walked away together, transformed by grace and truth, living proof that redemption was possible for those willing to do the work. Transformation isn't easy. Redemption isn't guaranteed. One officer was destroyed by his inability to change, another was redeemed by his willingness to transform. A city was changed by exposure of truth. A national conversation shifted. Real people's lives improved in measurable, meaningful ways. But the work continued. Because 3 words from a cold street corner had become a movement that changed a nation, and movements, once started, don't end. They evolve, expand, become the new foundation upon which better systems are built. And Tiffany Moreno, standing before the window of her Georgetown townhouse that night, watching lights twinkle across a city still imperfect but trying, knew that this was only the beginning. 18 months after a cold November night in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Tiffany Moreno stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. The Grand Assembly Hall soared above her, vaulted ceilings, flags of 150 nations arranged in careful protocol, simultaneous translation booths humming with the quiet efficiency of linguistic expertise translating hope into a dozen languages. The forum's topic, From Invisibility to Accountability, a case study in systemic change. The keynote speaker, a woman who'd transformed 3 days on concrete steps into a global movement for dignity. Tiffany wore an elegant blue gown bearing the Spanish royal insignia, the Medal of Civil Merit gleaming on her chest, Spain's highest civilian honor, awarded for her courage and commitment to human rights. But beneath the elegance, she carried something more valuable than any medal, the memory of cold, hunger, and invisibility that had taught her what no amount of diplomatic training ever could. Media from around the world positioned cameras to capture every angle. Dignitaries and ambassadors filled the seats, their attention focused entirely on the woman at the podium whose 3 words, "Yo soy embajadora," had become a rallying cry for justice in a dozen languages. Tiffany began speaking in Spanish, her native Castilian accent filling the hall, then seamlessly transitioned to English, then French, her linguistic mastery reminding everyone that language could be a bridge or a weapon, and she had chosen to build bridges. 18 months ago, she said, her voice steady and clear, I sat on cold concrete steps outside a closed community center in Washington, D.C. I was hungry. I was cold. I was invisible. Not because I had to be, but because I chose to be, to understand what millions of people experience not by choice, but by circumstance. She paused, letting the room absorb it. What I'm about to share isn't a story about 2 police officers who abused their power. It's a story about the systems that enabled them, the culture that encouraged them, and most importantly, the possibility of transformation when we choose accountability over comfort. The narrative unfolded with factual precision and emotional weight. She described the 3-day operation, the mockery in Spanish, the moment of revelation. But she spent more time on systemic issues than individual failures, the bureaucratic loops that trapped people, the social services overwhelmed and underfunded, the casual dehumanization that happened daily when society decided certain lives were less worthy of dignity. Visual presentations displayed the data, before and after statistics from Washington, D.C. and the 10 pilot cities. Arrests down 70%. Service connections up 200%. Permanent housing placements tripled. Recidivism rates for survival crimes dropped 65%. Emergency room visits by homeless individuals decreased 40% as preventive services became accessible. But more powerful than statistics were the faces. A video presentation played on screens throughout the hall. Maria appeared first, her gentle face filling the screen as she told her story. I was invisible until Ambassador Moreno sat beside me and asked my name. Not what I needed, not what was wrong, just my name. That's when I remembered I was still human. James spoke next, his military bearing evident even through the screen. She walked in my shoes for 3 days. Then she made the world walk in them too. Now I have housing, treatment, purpose. I help other veterans navigate the system that failed me. That's what transformation looks like. Sarah's testimony carried particular power. Ambassador Moreno didn't just expose officers. She exposed our society's failure to protect its most vulnerable. My children have a home now. I have a job. But more than that, I have my dignity back, and I learned it was never really gone. It just needed someone to see it. Bloomfield appeared on screen, his face carrying the weight of transformation earned through consistent action rather than empty words. I was part of the problem. I mocked, I dismissed, I treated human beings as obstacles. Ambassador Moreno could have destroyed me. Instead, she gave me a chance to be better. I'll spend the rest of my career ensuring no one else has to experience what she documented. Reed's face appeared briefly with text overlay, declined to participate. Even in absentia, his choice spoke volumes about paths not taken, redemption refused. Tiffany's voice carried across the hall. This wasn't about punishment. It was about transformation. Not just of individuals, but of systems. The Dignity First initiative has now been implemented in 127 cities across the United States. Housing first approaches paired with integrated social services. Law enforcement trained to connect people to resources rather than simply moving them along. Success measured by lives improved rather than streets cleared. She looked directly at the assembly, her gaze encompassing delegates from every continent. Homelessness is not an American problem. It's a human problem. Tokyo has its invisible populations. Sao Paulo has its forgotten streets. Paris has its excluded communities. Every nation represented here has people who sleep on cold concrete, who've been made to feel less than human, who deserve better than societies designed for those who already have stability. Her voice strengthened. The measure of a civilization isn't its monuments or wealth. It's how it treats those with neither. I'm proposing that this council adopt international standards for the treatment of homeless populations. That we recognize dignity as a fundamental human right, not contingent on address or employment or status. The Q&A session revealed the universal nature of the crisis. A Brazilian delegate described similar patterns in São Paulo. The French ambassador discussed Paris's challenges. A Japanese representative explored cultural differences in addressing homelessness. An African Union observer spoke honestly about resource constraints in developing nations. Tiffany responded to each with grace and specificity, acknowledging different contexts while insisting on universal principles. Human dignity doesn't change based on GDP. The details of implementation may vary, but the commitment to seeing people as people, that's non-negotiable. During the break, Tiffany stood in the diplomatic lounge, her phone pressed to her ear as Patricia Hawthorne provided updates from Washington. 127 cities implementing Dignity First. Federal funding increased to $150 million annually. Congress is drafting recognition legislation. Tiffany, you've changed the landscape. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source, Bloomfield, watching the UN webcast from the Riverside Community Center. Thank you for not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself. Tiffany replied immediately, thank you for choosing to be better. That choice mattered more than my revelation. Redemption, acknowledged. The evening reception buzzed with energy as delegates approached Tiffany with stories from their own countries, requests for consultation, invitations to speak, commitments to adopt the Dignity First model. The movement was going global, expanding beyond what she'd imagined possible when she'd sat on those cold steps 18 months ago. Across the ocean, in a small apartment in Washington, D.C., Wallace Reed watched the same UN webcast with a bottle of whiskey beside him. He saw Bloomfield praised, saw the lives transformed, saw what could have been his redemption if he'd chosen differently. Bitter tears mixed with whiskey as he turned off the screen, unable to watch what he could have become, choosing darkness over the difficult light of change. In the Riverside Community Center, that same webcast played on a large screen for a communal viewing party. Maria, James, Sarah, and dozens of others who'd been part of the transformation gathered with Bloomfield, watching their stories become part of international policy. When Tiffany mentioned Bloomfield's transformation, applause erupted. Maria's hand rested on his shoulder as tears of gratitude streamed down his face. Outside, on the community center steps, new homeless individuals arrived that evening, but they weren't met with harassment or mockery. An outreach team greeted them with resources, dignity, and respect. The plaque on the wall read, Site of Transformation, November 2025. Below it, Tiffany's words were engraved, Dignity isn't something we earn. It's something we are. Back in Geneva, Tiffany returned to the podium for her closing statement. The assembly hall quieted instantly. 18 months ago, I revealed my identity to 2 police officers, she said, her voice carrying the weight of journey and purpose. Tonight, I reveal something more important. Every person on every street corner has an identity worth honoring. Every human being deserves dignity, not as a privilege earned through employment or address, but as a right inherent to being human. She paused, her eyes sweeping across delegates from every nation. Change isn't easy. It's never easy. Systems resist transformation. Cultures push back against accountability. But change is always possible when we choose courage over comfort, when we choose to see rather than look away, when we choose to stand up rather than stay silent. The standing ovation was immediate and sustained. Hours later, the UN Human Rights Council voted on the resolution Tiffany had proposed. By overwhelming majority, international standards for the treatment of homeless populations were adopted, incorporating Dignity First principles into a framework that would guide policy worldwide. The first global commitment of its kind. Tiffany watched from the floor as history was made, knowing that this moment was born from a cold November night, from 3 days of hunger and cold, from 3 words that had changed everything. That night, alone in her Geneva hotel room, Tiffany stood at the window overlooking the city's twinkling lights. On her dresser sat the wire recording device, kept as a reminder of what truth required: proximity, courage, willingness to experience rather than merely observe. Beside it, the diplomatic ID that had changed 2 officers' lives and initiated a global movement. Her phone displayed a photo: Maria, James, and Sarah at the 1-year anniversary ceremony, their faces radiating dignity that had always been present but was finally being recognized. A text from the Spanish Prime Minister congratulated her on the UN resolution. She was exhausted but fulfilled, understanding that this journey from invisible to unavoidable, from cold concrete to international stage, had taught her what 20 years of diplomacy hadn't. That policy mattered most when it emerged from lived experience. That change happened when privilege became responsibility. That dignity was the most fundamental human right because without it, all other rights became meaningless. Tiffany opened her journal, beginning to write the memoir that would capture not just what happened but why it mattered. Some moments define us. Some moments define movements. That November night was both. I was an ambassador before. I'm still an ambassador. But now I'm an ambassador for something bigger than any nation. I'm an ambassador for the invisible, the dismissed, the forgotten. And I'll spend the rest of my life ensuring no one has to sit on cold concrete steps hoping someone will see their humanity. Epilogue. Maria became a lead trainer for the Dignity First initiative, teaching empathy to officers across the country. Her permanent housing evolved into a home filled with photos from her journey, including one from that November night. James now directs homeless services for veterans in 3 states, using his experience to help others navigate systems designed to exclude. Sarah founded a nonprofit supporting domestic violence survivors, ensuring no one else would find every shelter full when fleeing for their lives. Bloomfield was promoted to chief of the homelessness division, transforming from cautionary tale to case study in redemption through consistent action and genuine change. Reed remained in his small apartment, bitter and broken, a reminder that transformation requires willingness, and some choose darkness over the difficult work of becoming better. Tiffany continued the work, expanding Dignity First to over 200 cities worldwide, directly impacting over 50,000 lives while fundamentally shifting how societies viewed their most vulnerable. As Tiffany stood at her hotel window, her reflection overlapped with the memory of herself in worn clothing on cold steps. Both images were true. Both were her. The clothes had never mattered. Dignity had always been there, inherent and unshakable. She'd just forced the world to see it. She whispered into the Geneva night, her words a benediction and a promise. Somewhere tonight, someone sits on cold concrete. Someone feels invisible. Someone endures cruelty they don't deserve. But because of what happened on Riverside District steps, because of 3 words and an ID, because of the choice to stand up rather than stay silent, more people will stand with them. More people will see them. More people will remember, dignity isn't something we earn. It's something we are. And no one, no badge, no circumstance, no system, can take it away. Unless we let them. And we will never let them again.
Gentlemen, it appears you've been bullying the Spanish ambassador to your country. I trust you'll reconsider your actions.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.